Good morning. I think we will get started. I'm a little hesitant to use the microphone since we are such a small group, but I think that acoustics in this room makes it easier for those on the far end to hear if we use these. Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining, and thanks so much for finding your way to this room. I expect that there are still some participants who will join us who are on their way, so we will welcome them when they make it here. Just to quickly introduce myself, my name's Elizabeth Dirth. I'm the development director with the economic think tank called the Zoe Institute for Future Fit Economies. As it kind of says in the name, we work towards thinking about future fit economic policy at the EU level and also amongst a number of national governments. I have the great pleasure this morning to chair the session and moderate. I will also later in the session give a little bit of input from the perspective of Zoe's work and our work. And before I hand over to our guest, our keynote, I will just say a few words to set some context for this session, especially as it's quite a transition from the discussions of yesterday. So this is a parallel session on the geopolitics of long-term sustainability. We shift towards, in a sense, the sustainability challenges of the future and how we handle them. In contrast to the other two parallel sessions, which will talk about some tools or processes for integrating long-term into policy making today, and in this session, we're going to talk about the challenge, so the sustainability challenge, and some of the solutions and pathways in the sustainability transition. As many of you know, we are at an important juncture on a pathway towards sustainability where we've spent a tremendous amount of time and work and effort in defining goals. And these can be seen in things such as legally blinding climate targets at the national level. They can be seen at the international level in the SDGs. There's as well EU level targets. And this took decades to get there. And now we need to urgently shift towards implementation. And as we do that, that's bringing up some new wide range of challenges, most significantly how to decarbonize our economy and our industries. And this requires a massive redirection of investment into new technologies. It requires new industries emerging at a rapid pace, and it will require some industries to transform at a pace that they've never had to do before. And as this process unfolds, this has a huge impact on our resource use, our natural resources, and it also, and as well, the socio-cultural implications are just as deep as that. After all, there are no batteries without lithium, there's no agriculture without water, there's no wind turbines without iron ore, there's no cloud storage without energy, and there's no production of any of that without people and workers to produce that. This obviously creates a very strong business case for a transition to a circular economy, and it also poses a number of questions about how we guide this transition and the social, environmental, political, economic ramifications of that. So without further ado, I will introduce the Commissioner and hand over to him to set the scene for us before we begin the discussion. Please, the floor is yours.
Excellent. Thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. It's my great pleasure and privilege today to start this day with you, and I'm of course extremely happy to discuss an important topic, but most importantly, I really do love when in politics we discuss future, and not only future, but we also discuss, solutions and implementations, how we shape that future together. And when I look around the room, I can find really quite a lot that connects us. And I see people from, Baltic states. I see representative from the European Union, Westerners, Democrats, and even if we see each other for the first time, we already have a common ground to share, a common relationship. And each of these relationships, because they connect by those common values that we share, they're really dear to me. And they all defined first of all, a certain unity and certainty about the future. And yet, in politics, and especially in democracies, unity always goes with some sort of opposition, or at least discussions. And that's what parliaments in all democracies are all about, making alliances, in sometimes even opposing something. And it's precisely this constant flux of unity and opposition that forms the basis of our democracies. So in other words, next to unity we always find also rivalry, and today I'd like to touch upon these topics. So first of all, I would like us to celebrate this unity. The world is becoming increasingly united in understanding of the importance of the green agenda. I remember very well when we have started our term at the European Commission, 2050 Club, as I call it, with zero emissions, was basically really small a room with not many representatives in it. Today, I can say that it's not only unites most powerful economies around the globe, but it actually has even more ambitious ones who want to reach full decarbonization even before 2050. And what's, I think, very clear that treating our environment with respect is not simply a love for nature, it's not some tree-hugging initiatives, but it's about our own prosperity and competitiveness. And of course, at the end of the day, it facilitates and ensures safety. And you can look at that safety from different types of perspective. For example, food security and survivals of sectors such as agriculture, fisheries, thanks to care for biodiversity. Today, not yet in the summertime, but Europe is heading to a really disastrous drought, where, of course, first of all, those who is going to suffer are the farmers. Just yesterday, Spain announced that they will put 2 billion euros as sort of risk prevention, or I would say it's now too late, so measures to react to the upcoming drought that already has started in Spain, but it's going to be a similar situation in Italy, parts of France, even Germany and Portugal and Greece. So the situation is going to be extremely difficult. However, treating nature and environment with respect, it increases our economic resilience and autonomy, thanks to renewables, thanks to circular economy solutions, better human health, longevity of our society, and of course raises and preserves general living conditions thanks to continuous innovation. And for a long time, politics was very common to draw a distinction between environment and economy, or painted in a sort of clash that environmental activities or environment cannot coexist with the prosperous economy. Economy was only about output, manufacturing, production, services, exports of goods, and etc. True. But that's not no longer the case. And we even have numbers to clearly picture it. Around half of the world's total GDP, that's roughly 40 trillion euros, is dependent on nature. Sectorial estimations are that, first of all, it's construction, which is over 3.5 trillion euros, agriculture, over 2 trillion euros, food and beverages, which is over 1 trillion euros. So return on investment from restoring 46% of the world's degraded forests is at least 600%. And meaning for every euro we spend, we would earn 7 euros back by taking care of our only forests. It's just one ecosystem that I single out. And that is the most conservative estimation, and the actual benefits are very likely to be much, much higher. Meanwhile, 1.6 billion people in 51 countries will experience between 10 and 20% GDP reduction by the end of this decade if vital ecosystems are going to collapse. An estimated lifetime cost of plastic produced in a single year in 2019 is 3.4 trillion euros. So this due to loss of revenue from tourism, aquaculture, increased waste management costs. And if you look at the OECD numbers, between 1997 and 2011, the loss of biodiversity has cost anywhere between 3.7 trillion euros to 18 trillion euros yearly, due to, first of all, reduced crop yield, reduced fish catches, flooding and other disasters, and impact on medicine development and so on. Yet there is still people who ask, how much does it cost caring for the environment? And the answer is very clear: nothing. It's not a source of expense, it's an investment. It's a source of prosperity. And in fact, the single most important source of income for all of us. And on one hand, you can say, oh, that's politicians talking, and that's probably NGOs talking like that. But, you know, if you look at the World Economic Forum and what businesses has replied as what they see as the biggest threats to their businesses, 2 years perspective, out of 10 biggest threats, 5 are connected to environment and climate. 10 years perspective, all 10 are biggest threats connected to environment, biodiversity loss, and climate. That's business talking, not politicians with the green portfolios. So it's, I think at the end of the day, we need to look at, you know, at the effects. We need to bounce to those numbers. And when it comes to nature, when it comes to climate, those investments, they are future-proof. And as I said, we see now that member states across EU, they are forced to put those measures that cost billions of euros. If the investment would be done steadily year by year, today we would have a completely different situation. It's always easy to say that, you know, those investments, they might reduce economy and, you know, it's all about the long-term effects. But, you know, if you look what would happen if sub-Saharan Africa experienced severe economic contraction. So you would have new refugees waves, potential armed conflicts, human catastrophes. So we would all feel the effects and we would all pay the huge price. What would happen if the south of Europe clean water supply started dwindling? So once again, it would affect all the people, industries, directly and indirectly. It would have, of course, spillover effects, rising consumer prices, rising manufacturing costs. Extremely difficult to manage such consequences when you already have a disaster happening, and that always end up with the turmoil and political instability. So this just a few very real risks today, and I have not even mentioned those existential crises that biodiversity loss and climate crisis, climate change possess. So as I said at the beginning, I'm happy the world is becoming increasingly united in understanding, and here is just a positive proof of the past 6 months that I have witnessed personally. First of all, of course, that was a historic agreement that was reached in Montreal at COP15. Countries finally committed to set targets for preservation of biodiversity, restoration of biodiversity. We have finally historic agreement on the protection of the high seas, so-called the BBNJ, Beyond National Jurisdictions agreement that basically facilitates the implementation of the COP15. Last week I was in Brazil and had the pleasure to congratulate newly elected President Lula on his choice to, first of all, start his term by re-establishing the Amazon Fund for the protection of the rainforest, so calling international partners to fight deforestation together. And that's sort of a déjà vu moment when President Biden came to office. The first thing he did is returning to the table of the Paris Agreement, and of course President Lula's return with, first of all, commitment to save the Amazon forest really shows a positive spin. So, furthermore, going and looking at those rivalries, many countries' leaders have already realize that not only is caring for the environment beneficial, but it's one of the fastest growing global markets too. Battery demand will likely going to be much higher than supply very soon. We estimate that only in the EU, by 2030, we will have a growth of batteries use 14-fold, and 2030 is just around the corner. Europe is a leader in offshore renewable energy. Around 90% of all offshore wind capacity is here, and countries continue to exceed their targets. Automotive industry comprises around 11.5% of global manufacturing GDP, and it spends around 15 billion euros in research and innovation every year to look for a fully decarbonized vehicles. And that's why many countries, the public infrastructures is actually the bottleneck now for the transition to clean transportation. Some of the manufacturers are already investing heavily in hydrogen. In the EU, we also started our hydrogen bank initiative to kick off sort of a domestic hydrogen market. But if you look, similar things, they are going on in the US too. Last year, US adopted Inflation Reduction Act. They say that it's worth around 400 billion. I think it will be worth much, much more than that, because there is no clear ceilings indicated. Yet, IRA is not so much about inflation as it's about conquering the green markets globally and ensuring that those future technologies, they are first of all manufactured and produced in the US. Electric vehicles, solar panels, charging station, batteries, and so on. And in mere decade, thanks to the targeted public investments, first of all, China has become the biggest manufacturer of solar panels, as well as the biggest producer of solar energy. And here I think Europe at some point just dropped the ball. In energy, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon in development of the energy technologies. I think for some 5-8 years, Europe was a leader, but then we just dropped the ball and China picked it up. And now we have around 80% of global share in manufacturing in China, and around 1/3 of globally produced energy from solar in China. I could go on for a very long time. However, this should prove beyond any doubt that the green trade sort of, I don't want to call it wars or conflicts, but at least competition are taking place already. And our competitiveness depends on our capability to offer best solution, to facilitate and ensure strategic autonomy, which is crucial for the investments, for businesses to grow. However, there is always good rivalry and bad rivalry. And open trade has generated unseen prosperity in the history of the world, but with war, Russia's illegal and justified war against Ukraine and tensions in the Taiwan Strait, we also know the risks that are associated. And there are cases of bad rivalries when, of course, countries use their resources as a political pressure tools. And this is why we also need a resilience, autonomy of economies. And yet again, the green solutions are here to make us more resilient. It allows us to reuse what we already have done. So circular economy is one of the key solutions, reusing of resources. Secondly, of course, we need to de-risk relationship with some of the third countries, ensuring that, of course, our supply chains have a supply from as wide as possible number of countries. So I'll probably stop here. My point was that the green is the future, and it's a horizontal one, going across many of the policies, many of the initiatives, and it's the future of our economies. We see clearly the race about that future is becoming more and more increasing. More and more resources are put on the table. We need to find and ensure our role in it. We need to have ties with, first of all, democracies, with G7 countries, let's say, across the world, ensuring that we put the top technologies, the standards that, of course, are going to become global ones. And I clearly can identify, first of all, batteries, solar, offshore wind as a top key priorities, but let's look wider, let's look into hydrogen and other solutions, which again will allow us to de-risk our relationship with some of the third countries. So it's profitable, it's future-proof. At the end of the day, it's going to be a good help for our citizens, and it enhances security. I'll stop here. Thank you very much, and I'm very much looking forward for our discussions.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Before we move forward, I would just like to introduce a bit how I will run the rest of the session so that we all know what we have in store for the next hour or so. So we will have 2 rounds of discussion, as was a bit hinted. The first round will be a bit more on the challenges that we are facing in the sustainability transition when we look to the long term. And the second round will be a bit more on the solutions and pathways forward on this. I will ask a few of the panelists who are on my side of the table to come in at the beginning of the first couple of questions that I will ask. I've divided them between a solutions-focused and a challenge-focused perspective. Hopefully everyone knows which one they're sitting with by now. And after we have a couple of short inputs from the panelists, I will open the floor for anyone else that wants to comment, ask, give input, give perspective, and I welcome as much discussion as we can have this morning. Without further ado, I will just pose a couple of questions and then ask my 3 first panelists that will speak from a more challenged perspective to come in. So I would pose the questions to the room around what are the challenges that we face. We heard some outlined by the Commissioner, but perhaps there are others. When we think about the long-term transition towards sustainability, how will we face trade-offs and tensions, perhaps not just between industries, but between regions, sectors, and perhaps also for our use of scarce natural resources. Where and how are these unique and different between sectors, but perhaps there's also similarities, and what are the political ramifications of this? Just a few questions to put out there. I would love to come first to Lucas, if that's okay for me to call on you first. And then next I will come to Mr. Gregorich and Ms. Lübeck for some interventions on the challenges. Thanks. Go ahead.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Good morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure for me to be present at the discussion, but also to actually have a chance to welcome you once again to our parliament, to Lithuania. It's so great that this idea which came up in our discussions just 1 year ago, it became a reality so quickly. We had a very great introductory remarks, so I feel that I want to bring to the table maybe 3-4 points from my perspective, which I think would be relevant to the discussion. And naturally that comes from my sort of own experiences, and I would like to kickstart it from a little bit further away, maybe from sustainability, but that is something which I think became a very good sort of testing ground of dependencies globally, and that is the pandemic side. The global COVID-19 pandemic, I think it highlighted the dependencies in a different field, but it highlighted in a very extreme colors. When we all been faced with a big surprise, when we all been shocked with a massive amount of uncertainty to the extent of how we will survive this, we all managed to feel how this stable global trade environment became a totally different one. I had the responsibility of working in the previous government as a deputy chancellor, and we've been faced with this challenge of making sure that somehow we have the necessary equipment to start to deal with COVID. And we just realized that having orders, even not only from China, but even orders of simple masks just from UK, became a mission impossible. That was no longer a valid point. That dependency of having something shipped over, which used to be an overnight thing, became practically impossible to organize. So those dependencies which we somehow feel that we are stable, that we are very easy to organize. Actually, I think it highlighted the fact, and I think Europe to a certain extent also took a lot of lessons from it, starting to realize that in certain critical fields, we have to make sure that we have the capacities as close to us as possible, as local as possible, and that also contributes to the sustainability field as well. I think that lesson learned, it went deeply into the minds, at least in Lithuania, in the government offices, in public offices, to make sure that we look at the global trade opportunities in a way that in certain fields we have to have it closer at hand, something more local. And that is something which is now becoming a new reality of how we plan things and how we look at it, at the critical sectors in our economy, where it has to be not only fully outsourced. A second one, aspect which I wanted to highlight is something which happened later on, and that happened in our geopolitical field, just very close to us, and that is this unjustified war of Russia and Ukraine. And I think what happened is the reality of war was brought back into the minds. I mean, for me, individually, as a person, I grew up as a kid here, and I'm a kid of the 90s, so I didn't really even see a Soviet Union. But now, when I speak to my kids, we speak about the possibility of war. And I think what happened here, this reality came back, and that requires us to also see that eventually, and I'm a big believer of Ukrainian victory as soon as possible. We have to come prepared for it, because it will be a question of rebuilding. And when we talk about rebuilding, we have to make sure that sustainability is a critical part of it. We have to showcase, because that will be an opportunity for us to showcase how sustainability can be a big part, the core part of a rebuilding effort. And a third point I wanted to talk about, and that comes back a little bit more to something which I think Lithuania can be a good example in exactly to the challenges of geopolitics being converted to opportunities. And actually even more, when geopolitics can become a driving factor for innovation and for sustainability, sustainable solutions. And that is, for Lithuania, a big issue was dependency in energy segment in relation to Russia. And what we managed to do, we managed to look at it, realize that this is something which is a critical dependency which is no longer acceptable, which is a question of our energy independence. And therefore we pushed in a previous cadency. I feel that you already feel that I'm in a position in this parliament, so I used to work in the government last season. We managed to work on the issue of transforming our energy sector into the one which is driven by consumers who are, have all the necessary support, financial support, to become producers of energy as well. And we had one of the most significant, fast-growing entries into market. Then we divided up the energy segment into opportunities for people to put up solar panels on the roof and become not only consumers but also producers, making sure our energy market, energy grid is as divided as possible, but also as independent as possible. And there are still a lot of challenges still to go in that field, but at the moment it reached a very significant milestone of more or less ensuring our energy independence. I think that in certain areas, geopolitics can be, if we look at it right, a driver for innovations, especially in sustainability areas. But one sort of aspect which I always think that is critical, important to make sure that we plan and look at things with realistic perspective, and that is just the last note. Then planning, we should avoid over-ambitious planning. One of those things is, and it's also a local topic, in Lithuania we managed to approve a KPIs of 100% green procurement process. And it washes out the perspective, because that is an impossibility of things like that, and that is something which goes to the global scene as well. If you plan it realistically in a way to be able to really showcase the results. So 3 points and a bonus topic from my side. I'm looking forward to the next ones.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sekerit. I would next come to Ms. Lubeck, if you would like to give some thoughts here.
Right. Perspective from New Zealand. So thank you for having me and for the opportunity to make a few remarks. New Zealand's food and fibre sector is intrinsic to our country's economic success, and agriculture has basically defined our culture, communities and landscape for decades. We have 13 million hectares of land in production and 14% of our jobs, 82% of merchandise export earnings and 11% of our gross domestic product is dependent on food and fibre production. So the importance of the sector to our nation's well-being is really clear. Economic, societal and environmental prosperity is achievable. Sector growth is fundamental to New Zealand's success in tomorrow's world. There's very much to be positive about for the primary sector. We have export earnings of 55 billion forecast to the year ending June. Farmers and growers are embracing new ways of doing things and looking to protect and drive value. And so this is what one of the previous speakers referred to as industries having to transform at a level they never had to do before. And so for our agricultural sector, alongside traditional strength, the sector is becoming more diversified with projects ranging from large-scale sheep milking to developing medicinal cannabis industry in New Zealand. There's also growing demands from our trading partners to lift our sustainability efforts. The coming into force of the New Zealand-UK Free Trade Agreement at the end of this month highlights the government's commitment to opening new markets in an environment where sustainability is key. There are many challenges that we acknowledge and face, and they've been mentioned before already, but obviously they are climate change, labor shortages, global pandemic, unrest from Russia's illegal and unjustified war in Ukraine, global inflation and more. We must work through them and help people adapt rather than trying to turn back the clock or ignore the issues. A changing climate is already impacting New Zealand. Previous speaker spoke about the drought in Europe, but in New Zealand we have seen the opposite. Very, very disastrous weather through cyclones. Cyclone Gabrielle this year and North Island weather events have really had a very large-scale impact. New Zealand understands we must adapt and meet our sustainability goals alongside the rest of the world. We also must ensure the primary sector gets the people it needs to carry on growing in a sustainable way to ensure food security and continuation of our exports. The government continues to work with the agricultural sector on He Waka Eka Noa that aims to assist with farmers and growers on practical solutions to reduce New Zealand's emissions and build resilience to climate change. New Zealand is leading the world by incentivizing the reduction of agricultural emissions. Our aim is to accelerate the product development of tools available to farmers and growers to reduce emissions that's supported by a system to measure progress and fairly and effectively price them. The system will reflect our unique grass-based methods of farming where livestock live outdoors year-round. The farming sector will have input into the decisions around recycling income raised by the levy back to the sector, which will ultimately benefit that sector. This will ensure we have a solid plan and options in place to meet our nationally determined contributions in accordance with the Paris Agreement. It's important we get it right, so those discussions and work are ongoing. Part of the puzzle for New Zealand is ensuring we are utilizing sustainable farming practices, and to do this we need to get tools in the hands of farmers to enable meaningful reductions in emissions. The New Zealand government and large industry players launched the Centre for Climate Action on Agricultural Emissions in late 2022. The centre includes an exciting public-private joint venture with key sector businesses to develop the knowledge and technology to reduce agricultural emissions, commercialize smart new products and accelerate transformation. Consumer preferences are also changing the way we produce food. An example of those changing requirements from major customers is Tesco's announcement it aims to be carbon neutral by 2035. And that's in keeping with their ambition to have net zero emissions across its value chain by 2050, including those generated by the products it sells and across its supply chain. New Zealand's primary sector is already on a path towards transformation. New Zealand's largest dairy nutrition cooperative, Fonterra, recently partnered with Nestlé to develop New Zealand's first commercially viable net zero carbon emissions dairy farm. It's a great example of the leadership the dairy sector is taking to ensure a sustainable future and that New Zealand is producing the best products for the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for highlighting the fact that on the one hand we have problems with too little water, while at the same time problems with too much water as a result of some of the environmental changes and challenges we face. So thanks for the perspective and bringing us outside of Europe. As the last round of inputs for this kind of discussion or question focus, I would love to come to Mr. Gregorich to give also input from the Slovenian perspective. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you organizers for this panel. I think it's very, very well placed in time. Well, I will focus on challenges. European Commissioner Sinkiewicz put many challenges already, and he even highlighted the trillions of euro associated with some. I will start with climate change, which means in some areas drought, desertification, in some areas flooding, continuous flooding or repetitive flooding. Climate change brings challenge or maybe even wars for fresh water in rivers and lakes. It can produce hunger, it can produce uncontrolled migration, and it will definitely produce sea level rising. We can dispute, we can argue how much, and how much of this rising will be associated with higher levels of CO2 in the oceans, but sea level will probably rise. Then we have challenge in demography, in aging population, at least in EU, and at the moment, lack of workforce. In some countries, we must import workforce to run the agriculture, which I think is almost unsustainable. Then we must address wealth inequality. I think which it went to extreme. We have extreme rich. We didn't speak 50 years ago about billionaires, and now it's common. And on the other hand, masses of poor. And this gradient from high to low is always a driving force, and maybe not, we should not have too big driving forces. We need to contain consumerism. Consumerism is a basic principle of capitalism, but maybe we have too much consumerism, more and more products, and new products, and you need to replace the iPhone every 2 years, otherwise you are not in, or maybe it will not be updated. Overfishing. Then there is a question where to get strategic resources. Don't forget that during the 10 rounds of sanctions imposed on Russia because of the aggression, well, uranium was freely flown to US and to EU freely, and also for some time the same was with oil. And where do we get titanium? So we should be aware of the strategic resources of uranium, zirconium, lithium, cobalt, rare earth, titanium, and so on. And I think Europe is doing something, but maybe not enough. How to turn off coal mines, how to turn off oil rigs and natural gas fields. They are probably dealing very polite, but I'm sure they are lobbying to keep the businesses run. And these industries are still, as we speak, they are getting hidden or less hidden government subsidies, which we don't tackle. Then another challenge is how to make transport green. We will do, okay, we are now pushing into the electric vehicles. What about electric buses? What about electric trucks? It's not so easy. And of course, we want to have also hydrogen in cars or synthetic fuel, but there are two areas which consume huge amount of fuel, diesel or gasoline, not including the armies. I leave the armies out, but they are not innocent in this respect. But the airplanes, okay, we are working something on synthetic fuels. I don't know how far on this will be. Then another challenge, which is maybe solution, but I think it's also curse, is artificial intelligence. I am old-fashioned. I am BBC generation, born before computers, but I managed to do somehow. But I see basically no limits to artificial intelligence, and that is frightening. I don't want that this meeting is run by 10 artificial intelligence units, and the results are printed beforehand. Then there is another one which is positive, but also is very risky. And also artificial intelligence is very risky. Like nuclear is very risky. That's why we have so much on safety and security for nuclear. But bioengineering, I really hate the area which is called gain of function research. I'm not religious, but in this area we are playing with God. And if those of you that don't know what gain of function research means, Google it. Then there is also one challenge is old, archaic UN structure. We need a new UN Security Council. Now we have 15 permanent members, and this organization comes from 45. When 15 members was the governing board, Security Council, and the members were 50. Now there are 193, so almost 4 times so, and we have still 15. And it's absurd that the nation with 1.3 or 1.4 billion population is not on the permanent seat. So there should be permanent seat for India and all the countries that have more than, I don't know, 250 million or 300 million. So it means Brazil, Indonesia, Nigeria, and maybe somebody else. And also that those countries that have huge GDP, like Germany or Japan, are in. And of course, I give up on veto because that's no-go. Neither US nor China nor Russia will give up the veto. And then I will finish my list of challenges with emerging world currencies. We were for 50 years happy to have one single currency, dollar or petrodollar, and which is challenged at the moment, and maybe the unilateral sanctions that US imposed hit them back like a boomerang. I don't know, but and also together with that is money transfer platforms. Now, if your bank is not part of SWIFT, you have no bank. But also this monopoly maybe is fading away. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So from the speakers, we heard a number of things related to both the environmental challenges, the economic and industrial shift challenges from different regions. And I would now like to ask if anyone would like to come in either with questions or comments or responses. I will take hands. I see one already there, and I would just ask that you raise your hand until you see me kind of nod at you, and then you're welcome to put your hand down. That way I will try to acknowledge everyone while seeing that there's not name tags. So also apologies that I won't be introducing everyone else. But please, I take first from you, Katja, and then I see over here on the left. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I would have 3 questions, actually. Well, it's a lot, but I will take my chance. And the first question will be the environmental situation in Ukraine. which will be a huge challenge after the war. And being the former Polish chief, I know how it is terrible. The first to definitely start demining the Ukrainian territory. And I have to say that just recently in Batumi in Georgia, there was a mine in Black Sea, I mean, exploding. So it's quite a challenge for the Black Sea. It's kind of challenge for nuclear sustainability. And so what can you, I mean, how can you make the frame of the European Union, I mean, and what are the next plan regarding that? The second question will be about the energy independence of European Union. As yesterday I also just had been talking very openly and frankly that the warning was not from Ukrainians but from you, Lithuanians and the Baltic states, not to open up the Nord Stream the second. But what are the chances of the full energy independence of European Union, European countries, and what kind of what can be the position of the South Caucasus? I mean, Georgia, the transition and the transit and from Azerbaijan or Caspian. I mean, if you have the full picture, I know the negotiations have been opened, but still. And the third would be not regarding to the energy environment or sustainability, but as you're the commissioner, I would take the chance and I will ask you, what are the real talks about the Georgians to get a candidacy status regarding the number of the situation, what is going on in Georgia? I mean, because I know that it's not your profile, but, you know, I'm definitely very much interested. Yeah, I mean, you know, one hand is the government and the second hand is, you know, Georgian people were very pro-European. Just the three very, you know, I mean, very short answers would be okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If it's okay, I will also take some questions or comments from this side before asking the panelists if anyone would like to come back to the questions that are gathered from the floor. So I come to you as well.
Sorry. I'm Jenny Rathbone from the Welsh Parliament. Wales is probably the same size as New Zealand in terms of population, but smaller in geography. But most of our landmass is used for agriculture. So we have a very significant challenge to decarbonize our agriculture and our food, which we are not really making much progress on. We're not talking about it because the farmers are very sensitive to it. So, but we do have a new law coming in, and sustainable land management will be the framework on which we will reward our farmers. But I'd be very interested to hear a little bit more about exactly how Nestle is producing this carbon-free dairy and other measures that farmers are taking to decarbonize food, because this is the biggest carbon emitter of any individual citizen, much bigger than flying in a plane or anything like that. And this is the one that we really rarely talk about. Equally, I applaud the work being done by Ukraine to give consumers the power to be producers of energy. And here in Britain, we are not doing it. Germany has been very successful in this, enabling rural communities to become really significant producers of energy. And it's to do with too many regulations that make it difficult for people to get linked into the grid so they can sell their energy if they have surplus, or even just to get through the local city council that says you can't put solar panels on your roof. So there are huge challenges there, partly because the grid of the network of electricity distribution is hugely centralized, not at all fit for purpose, and mirrors the overly centralized system of governance we have in the UK. And one of the biggest disappointments for me is that we haven't used the spike in energy prices to actually make that a massive transition Instead, the UK government is still talking about giving more licenses for gas and oil production, which seems to me absolutely the wrong direction to be going in. And there is no incentive for the energy companies to change, because they are guaranteed the spot price of gas is what they charge citizens, which is hopeless in my view. So excellent contributions for everybody. And I think what Mr. Gregorich said about wealth inequality, that is probably the biggest threat to democracy of all. If we don't distribute resources more evenly, we'll just have chaos and war.
Thanks so much. Just to say how I will take the session forward, I will ask for responses from the Commissioner and Ms. Lubeck to the questions as they were a bit targeted at them. And then I will shift gears towards talking about solutions-focused, where I will set the scene for this topic, and then I will ask Mr. Jenkin and Mr. Hashimoto to come in as panelists on this side of things, and then again open the floor before we wrap up. So just to explain how we will progress forward. Would one of you like to start? Feel free, yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for your question. So, to begin with, environmental situation in Ukraine, so it's absolutely disastrous, and that disaster is continuing. Of course, it's extremely difficult to focus on environment when you have, first of all, you're witnessing people dying every day, innocent children, women, men, and cities just being totally destroyed. But you're absolutely right. The challenges, they just piling up, and the price tag of restoring, rebuilding Ukraine, restoring Ukraine's nature is going to be just immense. Starting with the ecosystems in the Black Sea, which is mined and which already puts many dangers, but then I think that when going into the land, that the situation is even much more worse, because one thing is mine territory. I visited myself, parts of Kiev suburbs, Irpin, Bucha, where the Russian military left, and they left huge territories mined after themselves. And that will be a generational task to demine Ukraine. But on top of that, you have constant targeting of infrastructure such as water treatment facilities, chemicals factories, or chemical storages. All that spills into the ground, into the water, into the soil, contaminating it. We don't know the situation, how it's going to end with the power plants. Zaporizhia power plant is the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, now being occupied by the Russian army, where they keep their strategic ammunition there, where they keep their troops. The people are forced to operate with the gun pointed at them. So the situation is extremely fragile, and the issues is just piling up. And, I'm not even talking about, all that burnt metal technique, which is oiled and etc. on 10,000s of tons of that. So we constantly work with the ministry. We have prepared together with the Ministry of Environment a methodology to document not only war crimes, but environmental crimes as well. And of course, I think, first of all, Russia has to be fully accountable for the crimes that they have done. We should not expect that, this pollution will respect any borders. So it's definitely going to affect also at least neighboring countries, and that is going to put pressures on ecosystems, on people's health at the neighboring countries too. Now, when speaking about the energy independence in Europe, I'm not going to go into any of the regions because, some negotiations are ongoing, but they are mainly to diversify the current energy mix, which is, at the end of the day, is a burden and a threat to our strategic autonomy. So I think the only way is to ensure full strategic autonomy, is ensuring that we are able to produce energy ourselves as much as is possible in the EU, and of course we need to speed up and scale up renewables. We need to look for alternative energy sources. That's of course also quite a task, because you need some critical raw materials, you need some minerals which not necessarily are in Europe. However, if we want to ensure green, decarbonized, autonomous future, renewables is the choice. And now with Russia's attack on Ukraine, that was a very clear to everyone. If we have had at the beginning, when we discussed our decarbonization plans, some member states said that the gas out of their energy mix will disappear in 2045. Now nobody even talks about such date, and the date is as soon as possible, and first of all getting rid of Russian gas, hopefully in 2 coming years, and then also moving on from gas to renewables as much as is possible. Yes, we still have some regions which will need to transit to gas and then to renewables, but that is going to happen at a completely different speed, because we saw the price that we have had to pay. And if someone expected that they had cheap gas contracts, already before the war started, Gazprom was providing minimal contract obligations, very clearly signaling to us that you should not support Ukraine, because otherwise you will be left out without the gas, and that would mean pressures on your businesses, on your households, and of course we cannot leave any of such dangers in the future. On Georgia, on one hand, I can say that 2022 June. Georgia was given a small opportunity window with 12 clear conditions. Look, but it is far more than could be expected. You said it's not my topic, but actually I had a very extensive talk with Georgia's Minister of Foreign Affairs on that, and usually quite active on supporting Ukraine's way. But there has to be clear efforts from the government. The government and the parliament, they will have to implement reforms. One thing is people will, but people's will, should be seen in the democratic elections, supporting the powers who has a clear pathway and willingness to transit. And then the government and the parliament, they will have to implement reforms, because joining the European Union is not only, getting invited, but it's a whole set of reforms and legislation that you have to adopt, that you have to harmonize the law with the European Union law. And we see that happening in Ukraine, and I have huge respect to their efforts. Despite the war, despite the top priority being the war, they are very successful in actually implementing reforms and ensuring that they implement those conditions. So Georgia has 12 conditions which it has to implement, and I hope that we won't see democratic backslide in Georgia, because if that happens, then it completely jeopardizes any of the chances joining the European Union. Just maybe a short remark, as I've lived three years in Wales myself, as I've studied in Aberystwyth.
Very good.
Yeah, I remember the situation very well, and I can hear that it didn't change much. But I think, the government has to facilitate. I know how difficult this is. It's a bit of a situation in Britain, but the government has to facilitate it, because we saw that people, they actually react very quickly. Last year in the European Union, we had a growth of 41% of sales of heat pumps and 40% of solar panels for domestic households. So people's reaction was very clear, partly due to of course, war, Russia's war against Ukraine, partly due to increased, of course, prices, and they saw that the prices fluctuate, and they were looking for solutions that, because installing the heat pump is not that cheap actually if you look into, for example, connecting to gas. But in the long term, you can, of course, save, and this is what the Europeans were looking for. So I think, it's extremely important that government facilitate. Britain has sometimes, trying to even overtake EU in the Green Deal priorities, and that has to be facilitated on the ground too. As regards the agriculture, I think it's probably the most difficult discussions that I'm having also at the EU level as regards the change in agriculture. But I think, you cannot escape what's waiting for you, and if ecosystems are going to collapse, droughts, floods, fires, water scarcity, you are busted. And there will be no technology, no fertilizer, pesticides, or whatever you want to use that can replace, those natural ecosystem values, which, of course, as a human beings, we don't value because we take them as a granted, pollinators. It's not the pesticide or price that I need to calculate into my operational costs. But if it's gone, those operational costs or even your yield is going to significantly decrease. This is very, very difficult discussions. You need to craft out very delicate and balanced decisions. I think overall, if you look at the agriculture system, it's very difficult. The whole set of the system, because on one hand, us as a politicians, we're pushing for food prices to be as low as possible. On the other hand, we say that we need to increase the income of our farmers. Somehow we miss the connection in between the two, and that's a difficult discussion which requires, of course, a very careful and crafted solutions, which is not going to be easy to find. And I already see that in EU we already meeting the first hurdles, and we kind of don't even try to jump over them, but we just fall.
Thank you so much. I'm conscious of time, and I want to come, if you don't mind, to be brief on your response, and then I want to shift gears and hear from our last panelists, conscious of not having so much time left in this interesting discussion. So please feel free to take a moment.
Thank you,
to respond.
Elizabeth. I will keep it really short, but just to, because the Commissioner has basically addressed some of Jenny's questions as well. Just to add to it, I think, I completely agree with the comment made by the Commissioner that the government needs to implement reforms. And I guess when I mentioned what New Zealand is doing with He Waka Eke Noa, which is a partnership with industry, Maori, which are the indigenous people of New Zealand, and government, it's empowering farmers and growers by providing information, tools and support for what we call an on-farm pricing system. So it addresses the on-farm greenhouse emissions, and it basically rewards any initiatives that the farmers take. So we support the information and tools to help with things like riparian planting, for example, and clean up the waterways in general. And so that way we give that support. What I do, and that would open up a whole new discussion, but the comment was made before on political ramifications, because of course at the moment, being part of a government that is putting all these regulations through, there is a natural dynamic in politics where you have opposition then calling that a war on farmers and promising to undo it all. So unfortunately, the way our adversarial political systems are set up, it makes it really difficult to drive through this positive change because of the noise that comes from it, the media picking up on the clickbait headlines. So, yeah, a totally different conversation we would be having here, but it's something that our government is really committed to. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I see your hand, but I would ask for you to bring it towards the end, because I do want to make sure to come to our last two panelists, and I would like to take a moment to allow us to switch gears to the more solutions-focused discussion. So thanks so much for the interventions from everyone so far. Just to bring us towards the second phase of the conversation to talk about some of the pathways forward, I would like to introduce two aspects of this, which I will then ask the final two panelists to speak to. And feel free for the final two panelists to also respond to some of the discussions that have come up in your interventions as well. And these two aspects that are on my mind relate to governance instruments and mechanisms and relate to financial flows. So these are two critical areas that are essential for the sustainability transition and for implementation. I would like to point to some of the policy instruments which have been mentioned so far around financial flows, whether it's the European Commission's recent Green Industrial Plan, the Recovery and Resilience Facility, the European Green Deal, the US's IRA. There's been a number of action taken by the public sector, by governments to create funding and investment to finance the sustainability transition. However, I would like to start this conversation with a study that we often quote from McKinsey, which points to the fact that to achieve net zero targets by 2050, the EU, just as the EU context, requires an additional investment of 28 trillion. This means around 900 billion per year. And for some perspective, the Recovery and Resilience Facility, which was celebrated as a huge instrument for financing the green and digital transition, which it absolutely has been, is around 700 billion in total, and that's divided over 6 years. So we definitely still have a finance gap. And critical to this is that this same study has found that 60% of those investments needed don't have a strong business case, which means that private sector finance is also difficult. And we need to be thinking about creative ways. At Zoe, we often talk about this idea of the quality of investment and not just the quantity of investment. And you can think about ways around linking investment to climate targets, to the national energy and climate plans, to other economic frameworks like the Commission's Transition Performance Index. We've also recently released an Economic Resilience Index, and you can see an example of how the Commission has done this in the Recovery and Resilience Facility, where they linked percentages of spend to climate activities, and they also included an environmental assessment, the do no significant harm assessment, which was mandatory across all aspects of these plans, which meant that environment was integrated in a way that it hadn't been before in public funding instruments. The second type of solution, before I hand over to our panelists, is then around this governance issue. And as I mentioned, some of the other parallel discussions are talking about this, but there's a number of ways that this can come in, whether this is through strategic foresight and how that might be mainstreamed across different sectors and policy areas. This is around how we align with metrics for progress and success of the government, of the economy. There's a lot that can be done at the parliamentary level, and some of the people that are at this Congress and including in this room are working on this and making important steps on that. There's 2 points around the coherence and coordination between policy areas within government. So is there the capacity to look at interacting different policy areas and how they connect with one another? And lastly, around leadership and political leadership, prioritizing resolving some of these issues and the sustainability transition. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to first Mr. Jenkin to discuss some of our challenges, or our solutions, our pathways forward in this, and then come to Mr. Hashimoto before wrapping up. So please, Mr. Jenkin.
Thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. Great to have an opportunity to take part in this discussion. Responding to your challenge to talk solutions and not problems, I've written down 3 key solutions, which I think are relevant to parliamentarians, because we are in our scrutiny committees in our parliaments. This is the sort of thing we should be encouraging our governments to think about. The first is understanding all the risks, not just the fashionable risks, but the unfashionable risks. Our government holds a national risk register. I think most governments now do hold a national risk register. And there was a parliamentary committee in the upper house, in the House of in the UK Parliament, which ran a whole inquiry scrutinising how useful the government's risk register actually is. And it found a whole lot of things which were simply not on the National Risk Register. So maybe all our committees should be making sure that government really understands the risks. And secondly, it is about, we're emerging from a long period since the end of the Second World War, and even more since the end of the Cold War, even though we've become more aware of global warming. Margaret Thatcher was one of the first global leaders to put climate change on the international agenda. But that was a long time ago now. That was the 1980s. But we're still in a kind of peacetime mentality in all our governments, that the retail issues of politics dominate, and we need to encourage, I think all our committees need to encourage our governments to go onto a kind of permanent emergency footing. We need to recognise, without becoming hysterical, that we are facing not just a climate emergency, but an emergency in everything, in complexity. I mean, the RAND Europe recently published 5 key challenges which face humanity. Climate change was only one of them. AI, the realignment towards China, disease control, and the polarization of democratic politics. For whatever reason, probably social media are a big influence. But these are all things that are making running our governments very much more difficult and very much more urgent because of the pace of events. And that is that permanent state of emergency is about getting our governments to be more resilient. People have talked about energy, the energy surprise, Lucas, you talked about, or the COVID surprise. Why are these things surprises? They're often, I keep using the phrase, predicted and predictable. We need to recognise that there are known risks which we can prepare much better for, but almost we need to get our governments to have machinery and capability and the adaptability and the agility to deal with the risks that we don't foresee. My favourite quote for strategic thinkers is from John Lennon. Life is what happens to you when you're making other plans. And I think we need to recognise that what's going to happen next year is mostly things we haven't even imagined. And the third is a really urgent one, is to recognise the world as it is, not that we would wish it to be. And to that extent, I mean, just look at the latest IPCC report, which was produced last month. It is the most depressing document that, while we're all achieving great things on our green agendas, in Europe, in many countries, most countries are not. Most countries are not. And some countries are saying what they will do, and they do exactly the opposite. I mean, talk about subsidizing the coal mines, Miroslav. Look at what Russia is doing. Look at what China is doing with fossil fuels, vastly expanding the consumption of fossil fuels. And in response to Virginia's and all the wonderful planning that the Commission is doing, I pick up one phrase you said. You know, if the water supplies in southern Europe start to dwindle, I think we need to recognise the psychology of the crisis we face. That it is very different from. It's going to a catastrophe happens very differently from something that you can plan for. I'm always thinking that in California they're always waiting for the big one, but until the big one arrives, they carry on living in California as though earthquakes hardly ever happen, which of course they hardly ever happen, and they're not going to happen tomorrow, and they're not going to happen when I'm taking the kids to school. But then when it happens, nobody's quite ready for it. So I suggest that the water supplies in southern Europe will suddenly end. It will be a drought, and it will be a catastrophic drought and it will be an emergency, and it might be a permanent one. It's the same with sea level rise. We have this image that somehow, the sea level is sort of inching up in a perceptible way. Well, I represent a part of the United Kingdom where there was a catastrophic flood in 1953, long before people knew about global warming. And many people drowned and large areas were flooded, and London was almost inundated. This is the way sea level rise will afflict us. It will come in a storm surge, and it will come in a particular part of the world. And it's probably the same, if you look at the IPCC paper, look at the heat maps, you see we talk about global temperature rise, 1.5 degrees by 2050, we hope, no more after that. I'm afraid that's not what the heat maps show. They show that the temperature rise over the land is much higher than the temperature rise over the water. The temperature rise in the polar regions, particularly in the northern polar region, is going to be much higher, accelerating the seamelt. But of course, the most stark thing is the red areas on the map that are going to become uninhabitable. They are very often the most highly densely populated parts of the world. And what kind of events are all these things going to drive? They're going to. One of the conclusions you have to accept in the world that we live in is that for all the international cooperation that we try to foster, actually most nations are in a kind of hyper competition, technological, for resources, and we might want, the democratic world might want a world of international cooperation, but most countries are not going to play that game. We're in a game which might even be termed as the survival of the fittest. One of the reasons why China is so interested in Russia is because China is going to run out of habitable living space if global temperatures rise as predicted and as feared, and China wants living space in Russia. So Russia is becoming a kind of client state of China. And one of the conclusions you have to come to is that, in fact, international conflict is likely to become more of the norm than the exception, because of the competition for resources, the competition for living space, the competition for water. That's before you get into other risks. So what can we learn from risk management? Well, business is moving much faster than governments in terms of evaluating risk, because business will not place investment, will not invest in businesses and regions and products where they think the climate risk or the conflict risk or the political risk is too high. So manufacturers are looking at de-risking their supply chains. COVID, big lesson. Actually go back to the Fukushima disaster and the tsunami in Japan, when suddenly everybody realized only certain kinds of chip only came from that region of Japan. And the consequence was whole businesses started reordering their business. Well, that was a tiny example of what businesses are beginning to do. All businesses are looking at their customers. Where are the markets that they should rely on? Well, they won't be relying on markets where there is going to be political turbulence or climate impact, which will disable those markets. Credit ratings agencies are looking at businesses that deserve to be credit rated and businesses that don't deserve to be credit rated. And they're looking at the impact of climate change and global conflict on businesses, and they will mark down the businesses. They're already marking down the businesses that look too risky. Insurance companies will increasingly refuse to insure against catastrophes. If there was a climate event that submerged the east coast of America, maybe we'll see a foreshadow of that, but would the insurance industry ever insure that area again, if that could happen again? And banks will stop lending. Banks do not lend to regions or businesses they think are too high risk. In the UK, there is one high street bank that is about to announce it is wholesale refusing mortgages to homes that are built on floodplains or are at risk of being flooded by tidal surges. So business is going to get ahead of us, and I think what parliamentarians should be able to do in our committees is translate the lessons from business and project them into government and get governments to respond much more actively to these risks in order to put the resources, that governments put the resources, the financial flows, as you say, to address the risks in the most effective way, not necessarily to sugar the pill of the transition, the green transition, but actually to mitigate the risks. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jenkin, and thank you for allowing a nice transition to Mr. Hashimoto in the final reflection for this morning before we wrap up.
Yeah, thank you. Indeed, it was a good transition, and because we were planning to talk about the bit of financing side of the whole sustainability. I'm aware that we are rapidly running out of time, so my comment is quite short, unfortunately. One of the things I would like to highlight is that the UK and the United States in particular have more venture capital driven or investment driven economic system, while in the continental Europe it's bank driven, bank, insurance company and so on. And you just Bernard just mentioned about the insurance company. Definitely in the continental Europe, insurance companies do own the debt securities, etc. Of the banks. So therefore, insurance company, for example, in Poland, like PZU, is highly exposed to the banking sector. All of them coming to it is that whatever the financial solutions we have in the United States or the United Kingdom cannot be duplicated to the European Union. Ecosystem or financial system of the continental Europe is drastically different, and the psychology of money is different in the continental Europe. So what is important here is that try to understand the ecosystem of the business and how the government works in each country, each economic bloc. As far as European continental ecosystem, so to say, is concerned, this startups having a hard time attracting the investment, partly because this venture capitalist ideology or the entrepreneurship ideology here is quite limited compared to the United States. So either European Union should import those startup ideas to the European continent and then implement the solution here, or we have to come up with a solution where banks or the traditional financial institutions are functioning as if filling in this gap in the financial sector. On top of that, what I see interesting, and this is a kind of like, how do you say, solution proposed just only on the theory and on the paper, it's not in the reality yet, is the role of a pension fund. The people are actually, the pensioners are going to suffer, and then they are quite vulnerable to any climate change or any sustainability. And so therefore, pensioners or pension funds can have a good communication with the pensioners or clients and saying like, look, we have your money for the future and we want to do something about the future. So there is some kind of alignment between the demand and the supply of future-oriented sustainable technology. So maybe what we can do as a parliamentarian is to facilitate this transition for that strategic transitional thinking for pension funds and the banks to facilitate, more development into the whole ecosystem, holistic ecosystem in the financial sector. And secondly, we can actually reduce the regulatory paperwork for the startups. I think that one of the challenges we have in the European continent is that our legal system and registration system requires huge paperwork and the administrative works, and that puts the huge pressure in terms of human resources for the startups. And what we can do as a government is to reduce the burden for the people to start the business and the people to scale up the business. So my 2 points, or two pennies, so to say, is that the one, to reduce the this administrative burden for the startups, and the second one is to facilitate the strategic change for the banking sector and the pension fund and the insurance company in the continental Europe to create or to boost up the financial environment in which the sustainability becomes a key. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm conscious of the time, so I'm going to try to wrap us up and leave here. I understand that there are points to be brought in, but I'm under the impression that I need to wrap up at 10:30, and we're already 10 minutes past that. So I would encourage you to have the conversations with the people that you would like to speak to as we take the journey back towards the other room, because we all know it's a little bit of a trek. So there's a moment for follow-up conversation there. I would just like to thank everyone for the interventions and questions, and for what has been quite a broad, wide-reaching discussion, from the range of environmental challenges to various policy solutions. And I would like to leave us all with an expression that one of the contacts that we've had around developing the Recovery and Resilience Fund in the Ministry of Environment in Spain talked to me about, which has sat with me and continues to sit with me whenever I'm thinking about working on discussing this topic, which is that the long-term and the short-term start on the same day. And we often forget that that's the case when it comes to our planning and our action. So we leave it there. Thank you so much, and see you all back in the main session.